Good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome you to George Washington University, to the Homeland Security Policy Institute. Let me also welcome the viewers on C-SPAN. I think we're in for a real treat today to hear from, and for complete transparency, need to say is a good friend of mine. Someone I think who probably stepped into the breach and took on, if not the hardest, certainly one of the most difficult jobs inside the United States government. Former administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. But someone who came to to the issue after 9/11 with a lot of experience from a FAA perspective, from the Department of Transportation's perspective, but also from the private sector, to be able to look at supply chain and risk and all the sorts of things that we talk about today when we talk about aviation security, but I'm not sure we always execute. Our verbs are not always at the same level of our nouns. But here to share some of his insights, not only on his time with TSA, but also to give a sense and a bit of a landscape in terms of where we are, where we hope to be, and what major gaps and shortfalls from a vulnerability perspective, but also from a process perspective, perhaps we can enhance our country's capability. I mean, all things said and done, this is one of the toughest jobs inside the U.S. government. And I used to say most people's impression of the government was the DMV or IRS. Rarely does that conjure up a great image in people's minds. And TSA is the next agency that has most contact in a day-to-day environment for the U.S. government. But they've got an important mission. I can tell you shortly after 9/11, there were steps that absolutely needed to be taken and needed to be taken quickly. That said, we've got to continue to ask the hard questions, make sure we're doing things as well as we can. And Kip, you're here to make us all smarter on these issues. So if you haven't bought it yet, Permanent Emergency, buy it. It's well worth the read. And I'm doing other interviews, and every call-in question has to do with your book, Kip. So congratulations on finishing that. No easy feat. And thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank, for the introduction. Thank you for hosting this. This means a great deal to me. Frank is one of the consistently sane voices in an otherwise discombobulated world, and it's an honor to be here under the auspices of the George Washington Homeland Security Policy Institute. And I hope we can make this interactive because I certainly have learned a lot in the last couple of days from some of the media questions on this. And probably the biggest learning is that if you just look in today's news and you see about the arrests in Los Angeles and 4-year-old pat-downs and congressional pat-downs, and we live in a world where TSA is a permanent emergency. And it kind of closes the loop on the name of my book, which is Permanent Emergency. And come to find out, today is a perfect example of how we have urgent, pressing, serious news very frequently about TSA, and therefore we never actually get out of the emergency mode. And now 10 years after 9/11, it is beyond time where we need to get out of that permanent emergency mode and find some ways to make good security, excellent security, world-class security something that is sustainable and supported by the American public. And I guess that's the place I would start off that got me going on the book was on January 20th, 2009, it struck noon, and I was outside in a cold day without a job, and I was like, okay, what next? And I realized that I was walking off with a lot of learnings that I'd had from being involved in situations that are unique, and there was no real way to download that to the public or really anyone else. And I just thought, the government, as the taxpayers have paid for all this experience, you ought to share it. And so that really started me thinking. And what we did is took the time period that I was around TSA, both beginning in 2001 and going up to 2009, and found the intelligence substrata of what was running through on the classified world. And I did a timeline looking at the various plots that I was involved with during that time, and then another timeline of what was going on in the public. And it was a complete, it's just, if you looked at one timeline, it was very familiar because we've all seen it. But then if you look at the bottom timeline, it was notable for the intensity of the plots. And I thought if the public knew both the up and the down of this timeline, it would be a far more informed discussion of TSA and counterterrorism in general. So that's what the book is. Nathan Means is the co-author, and I knew that Nathan is a very fine writer, and that's how I got to know him, and we worked together. And it was only upon discovering some time later when I was describing this to a colleague, well, have you Googled him? And yeah, a little bit. And turns out that young Nathan is a rock star and actually is part of a cult